How to world build polytheistic religions. Welcome to World Building Mastery, where I'm to teach you everything I know about world building. No AI is used on this channel. Today I will go over how to create religions for your setting, but specifically polytheistic ones. This video is something of a follow-up to my video on how to create fictional religions in general, and I would recommend watching that one first because it will help you to understand this one, although it isn't strictly necessary. So we'll be covering what polytheism is and how it differs from monotheism, the nature of the polytheistic worldview, how these things came into being, and finally I'll touch a little bit upon settings where gods are very tangible forces. So you've got all of that today. This will help you to create polytheistic religions in a setting which are just a lot deeper and interesting, and it will mainly help you to understand the nature of the polytheistic worldview a lot better, and perhaps give you a new perspective on the history of religion in general. So, let's begin. Part 1. What is polytheism? So before I even start, I do want to put a few disclaimers. First, while I do attempt to be impartial, it's kind of impossible to not talk about things from my own perspective, so some of my subjective viewpoints will probably slip through. Religion can be almost anything, so feel free to imagine whatever you want and whatever works for your setting, but I'm going to give you my perspective on what these things are and why. I once again ask that you do be respectful in the comments, since religion can naturally be quite a divisive subject. But, yada yada yada, don't crucify me for saying something you disagree with, okay? Now, if you've ever heard the term, I'm sure you know that polytheism is where a religion has more than one god, while monotheism is where a religion has only one god. However, if this is your whole understanding of the difference between the two, then it is an understanding which is severely lacking. I'm going to go over the differences between the two because it isn't just a quantitative difference, but a qualitative one. God, in a monotheistic sense, is something entirely different to what a god is in a polytheistic sense. So, God is, in some sense, another word for reality or nature. So the difference between polytheism and monotheism isn't just the number of deities which you pray to, but whether reality itself is conceived of as being of a single nature or as multiple distinct natures. It is the difference between an absolutist kind of universalist perspective on reality and a relativist perspective. Polytheism is not generally universalist and doesn't hold the same kind of absolutism of belief that is endemic to monotheism. God, in a monotheistic sense, isn't really conceived of as an entity or a being in the way that polytheistic gods are. God is seen as being itself, reality itself. Polytheistic gods are generally more conceived of as entities or perhaps as aspects of reality. But the key distinction is with polytheism, there are things which are outside of the god, whereas in monotheism, nothing is seen as being outside of God. So just another disclaimer, I am aware that I'm making wide sweeping generalizations here, and that there will be exceptions to this, but, especially in a fictional setting where anything's possible. So I'm not saying you have to construct a polytheistic religion in this way. I'm just saying that this is what they've generally been like historically. So if you want to do something different, you will need to justify why people believe the things that they do. Part 2. The polytheistic/pagan worldview. I want to elaborate a little further on what I mean by all of this. Again, this is my own perspective, so you may disagree with it, but I think my viewpoint here is well supported and shouldn't be too controversial. I'm not here today to tell you what is true or not religiously, of course. That's completely up to your own belief. Only to give you a useful framework for thinking about this in the context of world building. So I want to build upon the things that I discussed in my previous video, and perhaps change the way that you think about religion. I think that in most times and places across history, more often than not, people did not have religions as such, in the sense of having qualitatively distinct creeds. There was simply religion. They didn't necessarily have the clear belief systems, boundaries between them. There was just religion. And how religion manifested and how it was practiced certainly varied significantly between groups and sometimes between individuals, but there was a kind of common understanding that all of it was just religion. It's quite difficult to describe what I mean by this, but I will use the same example I used in my previous video, which is that when the Romans encountered pagan tribes, they did not regard those tribes as following a different religion as such. Certainly they followed a different religion, but they didn't follow a different religion, if that makes sense. So they regarded the gods worshipped by those tribes to be just as real as the ones which the Romans themselves worshipped, which might seem like a very alien concept to us today, regarding another culture's religion to be just as legitimate and real as your own. But in the ancient world, this was actually kind of a common understanding which made sense. Many ancient religions stemmed from things like ancestor worship. Ancestors ultimately becoming deified and reinterpreted as gods. Again, I'm oversimplifying here, and this is certainly not the only way that gods came into being. I'll elaborate more on this soon. But anyway, given this, it's kind of easy to see how one would regard like the ancestors of another culture to be just as real and in a certain sense just as important as the ones of one's own culture. It's kind of a similar deal with gods. It's like you don't tell another culture, oh, your ancestors aren't real, only my ancestors are real. Like, that would be ridiculous. Gods were kind of viewed in the same way. So historically, religion was treated a lot more subjectively, I think, and another culture's gods might be just as important, just not as important to you. So similarly, within a culture, like a blacksmith would be more likely to pray to Vulcan, while a sailor would be more likely to pray to Neptune. That isn't because they practice different religions per se, it's just that different aspects of reality have different subjective importance. And it was kind of a similar thing between different cultures as well. Now, again, I'm not saying that all polytheistic religions have been this way, but I have gone over all of this because I think it sheds light on how the polytheistic worldview actually works, like how people with this sort of belief system actually think. Part 3. The origin of religion. How religion originated is obviously a subject of academic debate, and I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers here. But I want to elaborate on it a little bit in this context, because my goal with this video is to give you an understanding of what a polytheistic or pagan worldview is actually like, to the best of my ability at least. So one of the earliest forms of religion was animism, which is something that I do recommend researching on your own if you're not familiar with it and if you're attempting to world build this sort of religion. To give a perhaps somewhat butchered summary, animism ascribes animacy to forces of nature or of the universe which are not obviously animate. This is the idea of like river spirits and just, things like that. Just the idea that things around us have spirits, basically. I believe I am right in saying that this sort of belief basically just sprang up everywhere that humans have ever really existed. Like, it's kind of just a natural assumption that we're making about the world. Whether that's because we're anthropomorphizing reality or just because we are spiritually aware, I'm going to leave you to decide that for yourself. But regardless, there are many theories, as I've mentioned, but it's believed that this, along with the ancestor worship I already mentioned, things like that it's how the concept of gods was kind of developed. So basically, all of this is to say that whatever forces a culture perceives as being the most influential over their lives are the ones which were they're most likely to deify and to pray to. So just bear that in mind when it comes to writing polytheistic religions and deciding what their pantheons will be. If you have a very seafaring culture, for example, they're going to emphasize the gods of the sea, the gods of the storm, this, that, and the other gods. Those are going to be emphasized a lot more than, say, I don't know, a god of the underground, or maybe it does kind of depend, but yeah, you probably have a god of the deep ocean rather than a god of the underground per se. So just things like that. It's just like you get these things originating from the forces surrounding them and also from their ancestors. So those things are both kind of deified. Part 4. Gods as worldly forces. So I want to talk a little bit about settings where gods are actually very apparent and tangible forces, since I know that for some settings that is the case, and maybe it's the case in yours. I talked a bit before about the qualitative differences between gods in a polytheistic sense and God in a monotheistic sense. In real life, whatever gods or forces govern this universe have kept themselves elusive enough that there is a high degree of subjectivity and interpretation, so people have wildly different religious beliefs. I'm not going to talk about this section as settings where gods are real, as just phrasing it that way would kind of implicitly invalidate every religion in the world. But there are certainly many fictional settings and historical mythologies where gods are seen as taking a much more hands-on role in shaping the world that we inhabit. So something I talked about in my previous video on writing religion is how religious beliefs don't simply stem from blind faith or arbitrary decision. Some people kind of seem to assume. Rather, there's always some kind of evidence behind it. Maybe, whatever it is. Maybe it's that there's an ancient historical account of something that happened, or maybe like some miracles that are being reported, or stuff like that. People find evidence for things like ghosts and UFOs as well. So people will find evidence, but there's always something. It's never just out of nothing, really. Or very, very rarely, at least. So, in a setting where gods take a very tangible and active role in the world, whatever that may be, there's going to be a lot more evidence going around. Perhaps the deities which people devote themselves to grant special powers or abilities to their followers. Perhaps the gods themselves descend from the heavens and routinely cull the population for their amusement. Whatever it is, people will take this evidence and they'll run with it. How to write a setting with this sort of active gods in it is a subject that would really warrant its own video, so I'll leave it at that for now. But yeah, that's the point I really wanted to make. It's the main one in regards to how it would affect religion in such a setting, is that there's just a lot more evidence. You do have to bear in mind, though, that this evidence still may be confusing or contradictory or subject to interpretation, so it doesn't necessarily kill the possibility of religious diversity. But yeah, I think I've made a point there. Also, monotheism can also be like this. Maybe your setting has a single absolute god, which really does influence the world in a very direct, kind of tangible way. Again, subject for another time. So, I'm sorry if I haven't given as much advice today on things like pantheon construction or religious rituals or organizations, etc. But all of that stuff kind of stems from deeper elements. And I wanted to focus on something specific for this video. I think I've achieved a decent explanation on that specific point, so hopefully you now have a clearer understanding of how a polytheistic worldview works, and how you can use it to enhance your own writing. So, there you go. This video has been part of a series I've been doing on how to worldbuild. If it has been helpful to you, then do go ahead and check out the rest of this series, because the advice I give in my other videos is just as good. If you're even more committed to improving your world building, then in the description below you can find a link to my paid community, where there are greater resources than I can offer here. The mission statement of World Building Mastery is to create the greatest community of world builders and writers on the internet, from whom the greatest artists of our generation will be born. If you want to be part of that, that's the place to go. In any case, thanks for watching, and I'll have more content to come soon. Bye!